I used to believe that sacrifice was a choice. I thought it was something you did because you loved someone, because you were willing to give up a part of yourself for them. But the truth is, sacrifice isn't a choice. It's a silent contract you sign the moment you decide to give your all to another person. And like any contract, once you sign, there's no going back. I never expected to feel the sting of that truth so sharply. My life, my choices, were always for them. For her, for him. My wife, Marissa, and our son, Ethan. They were my world. I worked tirelessly, from the first light of dawn until the last flicker of evening, building a life I thought they would appreciate. I thought they would see the long hours, the missed dinners, the birthdays forgotten in the name of work. I thought they would understand that it was all for them, for their future. But somewhere along the way, I lost them. I can still remember the first time I held Ethan in my arms, his tiny fingers grasping mine, his eyes, full of wonder and innocence, staring up at me as though I was his hero. I knew then that I would do anything to make sure he had the life he deserved. I worked my ass off, building a career from the ground up. There were nights I spent in cold, windowless offices, making deals, signing papers, pushing myself to the limit, all because I wanted to provide for them. The best schools, the best vacations, the finest clothes, the nicest house. I wanted them to want for nothing. But now, as I stood on the edge of a new chapter, watching my son prepare for his wedding, I couldn't help but wonder if it had all been in vain. I had sponsored the entire wedding. The venue, the catering, the dress, the flowers, everything. I had no problem with that. It was what fathers did for their children, wasn't it? I wanted Ethan to have the wedding of his dreams. I wanted him to feel special, to know that no matter what, I would be there for him. But I never imagined that I would be a mere spectator in the day I had worked so hard to make happen. I had always been the provider, the silent backbone of the family. But as I watched the preparations unfold, I noticed something that gnawed at me. My son wasn't looking at me like he used to. He wasn't the same boy who once relied on me for advice, for support. His eyes no longer lit up when I walked into the room. Instead, they shifted away, as if he were embarrassed by my presence. It wasn't just that. There was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Something in the air between us had changed, and I wasn't sure if it was my imagination or if I was just too caught up in my own feelings. But then, it became clear. Marissa had started seeing someone else. His name was Greg, and he was one of the few things in my life I couldn't control. A younger man, athletic, always laughing and making jokes. Everything I wasn't. I had never liked him. He was a reminder that I wasn't enough. That no matter how much I gave, no matter how much I sacrificed, it wasn't enough. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. Marissa and I had our issues, sure. Our marriage had always been strained. We had our ups and downs, like any couple, but I never thought it would come to this. But then I saw the way Ethan looked at Greg. The way his attention shifted from me to him, like I was some distant figure in his life. The way he would light up when Greg was around, as if I had been replaced. I remember the day Greg came over to our house for dinner. Ethan was grinning from ear to ear, eagerly pulling him into the living room like a child showing off a new toy. Marissa made all of Greg's favorite dishes, laughing and chatting with him as if I wasn't even there. I sat at the table, the emptiness in my chest growing heavier with every passing moment. The man who had been the pillar of this family, the man who had worked his fingers to the bone to give his wife and child everything they wanted, was now invisible. But still, I said nothing. I thought maybe it was a phase, that maybe it was just a passing moment in Ethan's life. I thought he'd come to his senses, see how much I had done for him, and appreciate it. But the more I watched, the more I realized I was fooling myself. Ethan wasn't a boy anymore. He was becoming a man, and I wasn't the person he wanted to become. The wedding was supposed to be the culmination of everything. My sacrifice, my work, my time. All of it leading up to this day. I thought, maybe, just maybe, my son would look at me with pride, with gratitude, and understand everything I had done for him. But there was nothing in his eyes but indifference. I remember standing there, in the quiet corner of the wedding venue, watching the guests mingle and laugh, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. I had spent my entire life building a future for him, for us, and in return, I had become a stranger to my own son. It wasn't just the wedding that hurt. It was everything. The years of giving, of providing, of sacrificing my own needs, only to watch him grow distant, pulling away, becoming someone I didn't even recognize. Someone who saw Greg, not me, as the important figure in his life. The thought settled in my mind like a slow burn. I had given them everything, my time, my money, my energy. But what had I gotten in return? A son who had forgotten who I was, and a wife who had moved on to someone else. At that moment, I realized something. I had built this life, but in doing so, I had built my own prison. A prison of sacrifice, of giving everything and receiving nothing. I had become a stranger in my own home, and the only thing left to do now was to accept that I couldn't keep giving. Not anymore. No, this wasn't just about a wedding. This was about everything. And maybe it was time I took back what was mine. The morning of the wedding was a blur of activity, a whirlwind of colors and sounds I barely had the energy to process. I had been awake since dawn, double-checking everything. The flowers, the venue, the food. Everything had to be perfect. For him, for my son. I had always dreamed of this day, of seeing my son walk down the aisle, a man of his own with the woman he loved by his side. He had always been my pride and joy. Watching him grow, knowing that I was the one who put him through school, who provided him with the opportunities he never could have had without me. Those were the moments I cherished most. So, when he told me he wanted a grand wedding, I didn't hesitate. I could afford it, and I would give it to him without question. But today, something felt off. The anticipation I once had about this day was being overshadowed by something I couldn't quite place. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch, a subtle tension hanging in the air that I could feel but not explain. I had thought that this day would be a celebration of family, a testament to the sacrifices I had made. Instead, I was becoming increasingly aware of how invisible I had become. As I walked through the crowd, I saw it. His mother's boyfriend, Jim, hovering near the front, his presence lingering like a shadow. I couldn't help but notice how Jim's role had grown over time. He had inserted himself into our lives more and more over the past few months, like a slow tide creeping in until it consumed everything. And now, here he was, standing proudly by my son's side, helping him adjust his tie as if it were his place. The bitterness in my chest grew, but I swallowed it down. After all, this was supposed to be his day. I watched as my son laughed and joked with Jim, barely sparing me a glance. A small, tight knot formed in my stomach. Where was the son who had looked up to me? Where was the gratitude for all I had done to get him here? Was I truly so irrelevant now, just another man in the background? I could feel myself slipping away, just like the remnants of his childhood that he had left behind. There was a gap now, a rift I hadn't seen coming. The ceremony itself was a blur. The vows, the clinking glasses, the photographers capturing every moment. Each click of the camera felt like a reminder of how far I had fallen from the spotlight. And it didn't help that every time I tried to make eye contact with my son, his gaze would quickly shift away, only to fall on Jim with a look that spoke volumes. It was as though I no longer existed, or at least, not in the way I used to. But the worst was yet to come. As the ceremony reached its climax, the moment where the newlyweds would be introduced as husband and wife, the unthinkable happened. The guests began clapping, cheering, and I stood there, smiling through the tightness in my chest, trying to hold back the overwhelming feelings that had begun to bubble up. Then, it happened. My son, standing there with his new bride, raised his glass, his eyes sweeping the crowd. And then he spoke. Not to me, not even to his new wife. No, he looked straight at Jim and raised his glass, giving him a nod of respect, a grateful gesture, as though he were the one who had given him everything. To Jim, he said, his voice loud and clear, for always being there when I needed him. It was as if the world had tilted on its axis. I stood frozen, my heart heavy with betrayal. My son, my flesh and blood, had publicly acknowledged Jim, his mother's boyfriend, while barely acknowledging my presence. I wasn't even a footnote in his life anymore. I had spent years working to provide him with a future, a legacy, and in a single sentence, he tore it all down. The deep well of sacrifice and love I had poured into him was reduced to nothing more than a background detail, swept away in favor of a man who had barely been in his life for more than a year. My pulse raced. My face flushed with anger, but I forced myself to keep it together. This wasn't the time for confrontation. This wasn't the place for any kind of outburst. I could feel my grip on my composure slipping, and I realized, with a sudden clarity, that there was nothing more to do. I had been a fool to believe this day would be anything other than a reflection of what had been happening for months. The subtle shift of priorities, the growing distance, the loss of what I had once thought was irreplaceable. But now, I saw it for what it was, a moment of finality. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a declaration that I had no place in my son's life anymore, that I had been relegated to the background, a once important figure now nothing more than a passing memory. I felt a calmness wash over me, a strange sort of peace. It was as though everything in me had clicked into place. I had been foolish to think I could keep holding on, trying to maintain the illusion of the family we once were. The truth had been right in front of me all along, and now it was clear. I looked at my son one last time, but he never saw me. His gaze remained fixed on Jim. That was all the answer I needed. Without a word, without making a scene, I turned and walked out. As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel angry. I felt nothing. There was no longer any need for me to stay. The illusion of family had shattered, and with it, my role in their lives. The weight of the years I had spent sacrificing for them, the endless work and effort, all of it faded into the background, as meaningless as the empty chairs and unspoken words I had left behind. The silence in the parking lot was deafening, and I knew, without a doubt, that everything had changed. I was done. I had played my part, and now it was time to walk away. I had been planning this moment all day, watching the events unfold like a quiet storm building in the distance. The wedding had been an orchestra of smiles, handshakes, and speeches that danced around the core of my pain. But all of that, every well-wishing and celebration, was just a facade, a performance for the guests, for everyone except the one person who mattered, me, my son, the man I had sacrificed everything for, who had turned away without a second glance. I could feel the tension rising, the satisfaction of my own power building slowly. The day had felt like a quiet erosion of my place in the family, but I wasn't going to let it end there. No, I had invested far too much of myself into them, into him, to just be discarded so easily. And this reception, this grand feast meant to celebrate him and his new life, was going to serve as the perfect lesson. While the guests were distracted, toasting, laughing, and reveling in the joy of the moment, I moved swiftly and quietly. Behind the scenes, the workers who had been instructed not to ask questions began dismantling the event. The trays of food, piled high with delicacies meant to please and impress, were taken away. The desserts, meticulously crafted by the finest pastry chefs, were removed one by one, leaving only empty tables and bare surfaces behind. The flowers, the balloons, the decorations, I had them taken down too. Every last detail that had been painstakingly put in place for this occasion, gone. It didn't take long, no more than an hour, before the reception hall was completely empty. The guests didn't suspect a thing. I stayed in the shadows, standing in the corner of the hall, watching as the minutes ticked by. A few exchanged puzzled looks, but no one had any clue. Not yet. And when the moment came, when the newlyweds made their entrance, they'd see exactly what I had orchestrated. And they wouldn't know what hit them. I could hear the chatter growing louder outside the hall as the music changed and people gathered in anticipation. Then, the grand doors swung open, and there they were, the couple of the hour. My son and his new wife. The stunned silence that followed their entrance was almost deafening. I watched through the small gap in the curtains as their faces morphed from joyous anticipation to confusion. My son took a step forward, his eyes scanning the room, his smile faltering as the realization hit him like a freight train. His wife, still holding his arm, looked around with growing concern. The decorations were gone. The tables were gone. The food, the cake, everything they had been expecting, the entire reason they'd entered the hall in the first place, was nowhere to be seen. A silence hung thick in the air as the newlyweds took a few more tentative steps into the barren room. Their guests, some still lingering in the doorway, were starting to murmur in disbelief. The atmosphere was charged with confusion, a wave of bewilderment spreading like wildfire across the crowd. It wasn't long before the first few voices raised in frustration, questioning what had happened, demanding to know where everything had gone. "Where's the food?" someone asked, breaking the tension. "Where's the cake?" another voice piped up, sharper now. I could feel a twisted satisfaction coursing through my veins as I stood in the shadows, observing the chaos unfold. It was a surreal moment. The look on my son's face, like a deer caught in headlights, his mouth opening and closing as if he were searching for an explanation that didn't exist, was more than enough. I knew it was happening. I could see it in his eyes. The realization was dawning on him, slowly and painfully, just how deeply he had wronged me. This wasn't just a mistake. This was something deliberate, something intentional. And now, with the entire hall reduced to nothing but empty space and unanswered questions, there was no running from the consequences. He turned to his bride, as if seeking confirmation that this was all some kind of misunderstanding, but she just looked at him with wide eyes, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. The guests began to shuffle uncomfortably, murmurs of disappointment rippling through the crowd. I had expected some kind of reaction, some shout of anger or confusion. But the silence that filled the room was even more powerful than any outburst. It was an echo of everything I had tried to do for my son, all the sacrifices, all the hard work. And in this empty hall, there was no denying the truth. They had taken me for granted. They had built their world around everyone but me. And this, the emptiness, the coldness, was my way of reminding them who had made it all possible. I could feel my pulse steady, my heart no longer racing. The bitter anger had faded, replaced by something else. Not vengeance, no, this wasn't about vengeance. This was about clarity. This was about forcing them to see the consequences of their actions, to understand the price of disrespecting someone who had given everything for them. They were standing in the emptiness I had created, and it was beautiful. It was the perfect metaphor for everything I had done for them, everything I had given them. All that I had invested, drained into the void. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. My son, standing there at the center of it all, seemed to understand. His shoulders sagged, his eyes widened, and I saw the realization settle in. The game had changed. There was no turning back. I had no intention of letting him forget this, not anytime soon. With a deep, satisfied breath, I turned and began to walk away. It wasn't my responsibility anymore to clean up their mess. As I stepped out of the hall and into the cool night air, I knew that my point had been made. The lesson had been delivered, loud and clear. The sound of frustrated voices reached me as I exited the building, but I didn't look back. I didn't need to. This was my moment of release, of finality. And there was no going back. I had made my mark. The night stretched on, filled with the echoes of my son and his wife desperately trying to salvage what was left of their wedding day. But the damage, as they say, was done. The hall that had been stripped bare of its promise stood as a silent witness to their humiliation. I could almost hear the whispers, the quiet panic, the uneasy smiles they put on for their guests. But in the end, it was all just a show. something to keep up appearances. What they couldn't see, though, was how deeply their actions had cut through the fabric of everything I'd worked for. I had long ago stopped caring about appearances, about what the world thought. My son's wedding had marked the last straw. It had confirmed what I had feared all along. I was nothing more than a tool, an ATM, a source of funding for their lavish lives. The moments of genuine connection, the appreciation I'd hoped for, were nothing more than fantasies of a past I no longer recognized. As I left the reception, I felt no satisfaction, no bitterness even, just a profound emptiness, a peace that came from walking away from a world that no longer served me. There was no triumph in this act. There was only cold finality. The next few days passed in a blur. I didn't need to speak to anyone. There was no need for explanations. The moment I'd made my decision, it was final. It wasn't just about the wedding. It wasn't about the humiliation or the anger. It was about my own sense of peace, my own freedom. I knew what I had to do. The divorce papers were ready. I didn't need to waste any time. The years of frustration, the emotional distance that had steadily grown between my wife and me, had culminated in a single, irrevocable act, the end of everything. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't seeking vengeance. I was simply moving on, and I wouldn't waste another minute in a relationship that had lost all meaning. I watched as the lawyer prepared the paperwork, a coldness in my heart that had once been filled with love and commitment. It wasn't something I had rushed into, though it felt like a natural progression of events. It was the final step in my transformation, the last chapter in a life that had been defined by sacrifice, betrayal, and unappreciation. I didn't tell her. I didn't need to. When the papers were served, she would know exactly what they meant. The marriage, the shared life, the years we spent pretending, gone, with the flick of a pen. It didn't take long for the ripples of that decision to spread. Within hours of receiving the divorce papers, my wife called, her voice shaking with shock and confusion. I listened to her plea, her attempts to apologize and rationalize. But it was no use. Nothing she said could undo the reality I had lived with for so many years. The more she tried to explain, the more I realized how far removed she was from the truth of what had happened. She was trying to salvage something that had been broken long before that day, before the wedding, before the distance between us grew insurmountable. She had always been focused on her own needs, on the external world, and in doing so, had left me stranded in the shadows. She didn't even acknowledge my sacrifices, not the years I'd spent working tirelessly to provide, not the times I'd put aside my own happiness to ensure that they had everything they needed. To her, I was just a backdrop, an accessory to her life, and the final straw had been watching her eyes not turn to me, but to her new boyfriend, as if I were nothing. I had tried. I had given more than I had in me. But when your heart is no longer in it, when you've been drained of every last drop of love, there's nothing left to give. The next step was something even colder. The assets, the houses, the investments, the properties I had worked so hard to secure for them. All of it was being taken back. The accounts that had been set up, the trust funds that were supposed to provide for their future, all of it was being dissolved. I had given them everything, and now I was taking it all back. I knew they wouldn't expect it. They had never once considered that I might take it all away. My son, especially, would be blindsided. But why should they have any claim on what I had worked for? Why should they profit from my sacrifice when they had so clearly shown me no respect? I started with the houses. The one in the city, the one in the country, it didn't matter anymore. I had it all transferred into my name, the deeds handed back to me. I called the investment firms, gave instructions to pull out every cent I had contributed to their futures, and redirected it all into my own accounts. Each step, each transaction, was a silent declaration of my severance from the life I had once built for them. As the hours turned into days, I could feel the weight of my decisions settling into place. It wasn't about being cruel. It wasn't about showing them who had the power. It was simply about removing myself from the equation. It was about freeing myself from the emotional prison I had been living in for far too long. And then there was the final piece, the belongings. Everything that had once been theirs, that I had given them, I took. The luxury cars, the designer clothes, the expensive jewelry, all of it was removed, packed up, and sent away. It wasn't revenge. It was closure. I had spent years working to build a life for them, and now I was taking back what had always belonged to me. When it was done, when the dust had settled and the last of the properties had been claimed, I stood alone in my home, looking around at the emptiness I had created. The walls that had once been filled with family photographs, the living room that had once been the setting for family dinners and celebrations, everything had been cleared away. It was a silent, peaceful emptiness. I could breathe again. I was free. As I walked away from the remnants of my old life, I realized that I no longer cared about their reactions. The phone calls, the text messages, the pleadings, I would ignore them all. I had made my choice. And now, I was moving forward, leaving the past behind, leaving them behind. There was nothing left to say. I had done what needed to be done. It was over. And in that finality, I found the peace I had been searching for all along. It's said that when you burn a bridge, you don't always realize how far you are from the other side until you've already jumped. For my son and my wife, that realization came swiftly after the last shred of my presence left their lives, like the final gust of wind sweeping away the last leaves of autumn. What they hadn't understood for years became undeniable once they were forced to face it. I was the foundation they had been standing on. Without me, they were nothing. The son's realization came swiftly, and it wasn't kind. In the days following my departure, I saw the once proud young man crumble under the weight of his own choices. He was too proud to admit it at first, but as the days bled into weeks, the truth seeped into his bones like a cold draft he couldn't escape. With no inheritance to rely on, no trust funds, no grand wedding gift to speak of, he was nothing more than an adult man with no guidance, no resources, and no one to turn to. His wife, now his partner in this fragile, crumbling world, couldn't carry the burden of his mistakes. It wasn't long before I received a series of phone calls from him, the tone growing more desperate with each passing day. At first, he had tried to talk to me, to ask what he had done wrong. But I wasn't there to listen anymore. I didn't need to hear his pleas. I had been listening to them all my life. I had watched him slip away from me over the years, as he grew more concerned with impressing people who didn't matter, with showing off for a world that would never truly appreciate him. My absence, my silence, was the last lesson he would ever learn. For the first time in his life, my son was faced with an uncomfortable, undeniable truth. He had taken everything I had given him for granted. The cars, the homes, the money. It had all been so easy. He never had to fight for it, never had to worry where the next meal was coming from. All he had to do was sit in the comfort of his privileged life and pretend like he earned it. But now, with nothing left but his pride and a broken marriage, he was forced to look in the mirror and see himself for who he truly was. He tried to rebuild, of course. Everyone does when the rug is pulled out from under them. But there was no way to fix what was broken. The relationships, the trust, the expectations of family, it had all been shattered. The awkward calls, the strained attempts to reconnect, only made the void between us grow wider. In the midst of it, he finally began to understand. My love had been the very thing holding him together, even if he had never seen it until it was too late. As for my wife, her situation was far more complex. The divorce papers hadn't been just a shock to her. They were the end of a life she had never truly valued, at least not in the way I had. For years, I had been the provider, the rock upon which she leaned. But when she had turned to someone else, when her eyes strayed from me, I knew that everything had changed. She had been taken by the allure of a new life, a new beginning, something that didn't involve me and my unwavering dedication. And yet, when the wealth and comfort I had provided slipped from her fingers, she felt the sting. I wasn't sure what hurt her more. The fact that she had lost everything I had given her, or the guilt of knowing that, in some small way, she was partially responsible for the collapse of her marriage. She had always resented me for the time I spent away from home, for the sacrifices I made for our family, thinking I cared more about my work than I did about her. But now, as she stood with her new boyfriend, she could see that the very thing she had taken for granted, the wealth, the stability, the security, was gone. Her relationship with the boyfriend was no longer as smooth as it had once been. The cracks began to show in their connection, the magic of the early days slowly fading. She started to question his commitment, his motivations. Was he really in this for love? Or was he just another man who wanted something from her, just like the others in her life? She had always been prideful, but now, she found herself humbling in ways she hadn't expected. Her pride kept her from admitting that she was scared. Scared of being alone, scared of losing everything she had ever known, scared of being just another person who had been cast aside. I wasn't there to fix it, and for the first time, she had to face the consequences of her actions on her own. It wasn't easy for her to swallow her pride. I knew that she regretted losing me, but she never would have admitted it out loud. She would never admit to being wrong. Both the son and the wife found themselves trapped in a mess of their own making. They tried, of course, to rebuild. The son, in his desperation, applied for jobs, something he had never had to do before. He looked for ways to pay bills, to take care of himself, to live without the cushion I had provided. But the world was a cold place for someone who had never truly learned to stand on their own. He struggled. There was no easy way out. The connections he had once relied on were gone, and the people he had once trusted, those who only saw him as a wealthy man's son, began to distance themselves. My wife, on the other hand, tried to keep up appearances, but the cracks in her relationship with her boyfriend became too visible to ignore. She had once relied on me to give her everything she needed, financial stability, the luxury of not worrying about the future. But now, she was forced to acknowledge the true cost of her choices. She had sacrificed me for someone who was now proving to be unreliable, a partner who couldn't offer her the security she had once taken for granted. They tried to put on brave faces, but I could see through it all. The facade cracked, the proud exteriors fell away, and the cold reality of their situation set in. My departure had left them with nothing to lean on, nothing to keep them upright. And it was in this void, in the aftermath of their own pride, that they began to realize the true cost of their actions. Too late to undo the damage, they now had to live with the consequences of their choices. As I look back on all of this, I can't say I feel pity for them. Not anymore. They had their chance, their moment, and they squandered it. What I do feel is a strange sense of peace, knowing that I'm no longer part of their tangled web. I've moved on, and in some ways, I'm stronger for it. The son and my wife may never understand the full scope of what they've lost, but that's their journey now, not mine. I've walked away, and I'm not looking back. The sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shore fills my thoughts as I sit on the balcony of a small, humble house I bought with nothing but my own efforts and a lifetime of lessons. No luxury, no grand estates, just peace. Just me. And for the first time in years, it feels like a victory. The Father's new life isn't one of opulence or comfort, but it's mine. It's built on my terms, on my rules. No one to answer to. No expectations to meet. There's something deeply satisfying about that. A feeling of liberation so strong, it can't be measured by the amount of wealth I left behind or the possessions I once thought defined me. Every day, I wake up to the simple reality of my new life. There's no one to call me, no one to need me. I don't worry about being asked for more, given more, or being expected to give even when there's nothing left to give. I've let go of the shackles that once held me to a family who saw me as a means to an end. I've stopped seeking their approval, and in doing so, I've found a freedom I never knew was possible. I walk down the quiet streets of this coastal town, where no one knows my name, and I feel the weight of years of emotional labor lift off my shoulders. The silence, The solitude. There's nothing like it. No one calls me with problems. No one asks for favors. No one expects me to be something I'm not. I'm just a man living for himself. In this life, there is no room for regret, no room for doubt. I've made peace with my decision to leave. I know that some would call me bitter, some might even call me heartless, but they don't understand. They can't understand what it feels like to give everything. Your love, your time, your money, to people who only see you as a stepping stone. They don't understand what it feels like to finally take your life back, to stop being the person others think they can mold into their image. I've stopped seeking validation from a family that couldn't see the sacrifices I made. For years, I've been over backward, never questioning the toll it took on me. But walking away, leaving them all behind, has been the most empowering decision I've ever made. And now, I am finally able to breathe, to truly live. I sometimes catch myself thinking about my son. He's grown now, older and, I imagine, a little wiser. I know he must wonder what happened to me. Was it worth it? Was it worth losing everything? In the moments of solitude, I can almost hear his thoughts. Does he regret the way he treated me? Does he miss me, even just a little? But I've learned that it's not my job to fix what's broken in him. I've already done enough. I can't undo the past, and I wouldn't if I could. His regret, if he truly feels it, is something he will have to carry with him for the rest of his life. It's the price he paid for taking me for granted, for believing that I would always be there to clean up the mess he made. There are moments when I allow myself to entertain the idea of reconciliation, of a father and son reconnecting after all these years. But that idea is fleeting. It's a beautiful thought, but it's rooted in a past that no longer exists. The truth is, I lost my son a long time ago. The boy I once knew is gone, replaced by someone who didn't value what I gave him, someone who thought he could live without me. There's no going back now. My decision to leave wasn't about punishment. It was about freedom. I chose to live for myself, to stop pretending that my worth was tied to what others wanted from me. As I sit on the porch, the cool breeze mingling with the scent of salt water, I reflect on how far I've come. It wasn't easy to get here. It wasn't easy to let go of a life that once seemed so important. But I've realized something. In all my years of working, of sacrificing, of loving and giving, I was never really living. I was just existing. I was chasing something that didn't exist, a sense of appreciation that was never coming. Now, I live for me, for my own happiness, for my own peace. I don't need anyone's validation. I don't need anyone's approval. All I need is to wake up in the morning and know that I'm free. In the quiet stillness of my new life, I occasionally wonder if they, my son, my wife, ever think about me. Do they feel the emptiness that I left behind? Do they understand why I walked away? The son I raised, the wife I loved. Could they ever comprehend the depth of my decision? But those thoughts are fleeting. The reality is that I've moved on. I've learned to embrace the space between us. It's not about them anymore. It's about me, my happiness, my peace. As the sun sets over the horizon, I feel a sense of calm I haven't felt in years. The world may continue to spin, but for me, everything has already shifted. I have no intention of looking back. The past is done. The future is mine to shape. And with that, I smile to myself, knowing that for the first time in my life, I am finally whole. I am finally free. If you found yourself moved by this journey of sacrifice, betrayal, and freedom, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to make a tough decision that changed your life? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that touches the heart and challenges the soul. Thank you for joining me in this experience. Until next time, take care of yourself and those who truly value you. See you soon.